Princess Violeth Kassan had never known defeat, and she certainly did not expect to learn its taste from a human of all creatures in the vast galaxy that stretched endlessly before her throne. The great hall of the Volanti Imperial Palace gleamed with crystals that had taken 1,000 years to grow, and dignitaries from 100 worlds filled the space with whispered conversations and careful political smiles. Violeth sat upon her elevated seat, her silver skin catching the light of 3 artificial suns that hung suspended above the gathering, and her 4 eyes scanned the crowd with practiced boredom. She was the 3rd daughter of Emperor Kaysan the Eternal, and while she would never sit upon the throne herself, she had carved out her own form of power through the ancient game of Naxxarana. One in living memory had defeated her at the strategy game that her people had perfected over 10,000 years of logical evolution. The Volanti were beings of pure reason, their minds capable of calculating thousands of possibilities in the span of a heartbeat, and emotions were considered a primitive weakness that they had long ago evolved beyond when the human delegation entered the hall. Violeth felt her interest stir for the first time in decades. She had heard of these newcomers to the galactic stage, these soft and fragile creatures from a small blue world called Earth, and everything she had learned about them filled her with a mixture of amusement and contempt. They lived for barely a century. Their bodies were weak and required constant maintenance, and worst of all, they were ruled by emotions that clouded their judgment and led them to make foolish decisions. The leader of the human delegation was a tall male with dark skin and eyes that held a strange light. Violeth could not quite identify his name was Commander Marcus Cole, and he walked through the crowd of superior alien beings with a confidence that seemed almost insulting given his species' lowly status. The humans had come to the Galactic Concord, seeking mining rights in the Outer Rim territories, a modest request that the Council had been debating for months without reaching any conclusion. Violeth saw an opportunity for entertainment. She rose from her seat, and the hall fell silent. For when a princess of the blood moved, all others were expected to wait and watch. "Human," she called out, her voice carrying across the crystal chamber with perfect clarity. "I have heard that your species enjoys games of chance and strategy, and I find myself curious whether such primitive minds can grasp the complexities of true intellectual combat." Marcus Cole turned to face her, and instead of the fear or submission she expected to see, she found only calm curiosity in his expression. "We do enjoy our games, Your Highness," he replied in a voice that carried no tremor, "and I would be honored to learn whatever game you wish to teach me." Violeth felt a smile curve her thin lips as she descended from her platform and approached the human. "The game is called Mexera," she explained, while servants rushed to bring forth the ornate board with its hundreds of crystalline pieces, and it is the ultimate test of logical thinking and strategic planning, a game my people have mastered over millennia of refinement. She gestured for him to sit across from her at the table that had been placed in the center of the hall. "I propose a wager to make things interesting," she continued. "For what is a game without stakes to sharpen the mind?" The human raised an eyebrow but nodded for her to continue. "If I win, your species will abandon your claim to the Outer Rim and serve as vassals to the Volanti Empire for 100 of your years," Violeth declared. "But if by some miracle you manage to defeat me, I will bind myself to you in marriage according to the ancient laws, and humanity will receive full partnership in the Empire with all rights and privileges that entails." Gasps echoed through the hall, and Violeth heard her father's sharp intake of breath from his throne above. But she had spoken the words before witnesses, and Volanti lore was absolute. She had no fear of losing, for the very idea was laughable. Marcus Cole studied her for a long moment, and something flickered in those strange human eyes that she could not read. "I accept your terms," "Princess," he said simply. The game began. Virolith moved her pieces with the precision of a master. Each placement calculated to create cascading advantages dozens of moves ahead. Mind processed probability trees that would have taken a human computer hours to calculate. And she felt the familiar pleasure of intellectual dominance. As her strategy unfolded, but something was wrong. The human did not play like any opponent she had faced in her centuries of competition. He made moves that seemed to have no logical purpose, sacrificing valuable pieces for no apparent gain, and positioning his forces in patterns that defied every principle of Nexera strategy. Virolith found herself unable to predict his next move because there was no rational framework to his choices. Hours passed, and the crowd watched in growing disbelief as the game continued far longer than anyone had expected. Virolith began to feel something she had not experienced since childhood. A cold sensation that crept up her spine and whispered warnings she did not want to hear. The human was not playing to win, she realized with growing horror. He was playing to make her lose. Every irrational move, every senseless sacrifice, was designed to create chaos on the board that her logical mind struggled to navigate. She had spent her entire life preparing for opponents who thought as she did, and she had no defense against an enemy who refused to think at all when Marcus Cole made his final move. Virolith stared at the board in silence for a very long time. Her king piece was trapped, surrounded by human forces that had no business being where they were. And no matter how many times she calculated the possibilities, she could find no escape. "I believe that is checkmate, Your Highness," the human said softly, and there was no triumph in his voice. Only a quiet acknowledgement of what had occurred. The hall erupted into chaos as Volanti nobles shouted in disbelief and human diplomats exchanged stunned glances. Virolith Kassan, the undefeated champion of Nexera, had lost to a primitive creature from a backwater world. And now, according to the sacred laws of her people that could not be broken or bent, she was bound to marry him. She looked up from the board and met the human's eyes, searching for mockery or cruelty, but finding only that same unreadable expression. "How?" she asked, the single word carrying all her confusion and wounded pride. Marcus Cole leaned forward slightly and spoke in a voice meant only for her. "You played the game that existed on the board, Princess, but I played the game that existed in your mind. And you never saw me coming because you never believed I could be a threat." Virolith felt the foundations of everything she believed begin to crack. Perhaps humans were not as primitive as she had thought. Perhaps she had just made the most interesting mistake of her very long life. The days following her defeat were the most difficult of Virolith's long existence, and she spent much of that time alone in her chambers while the Empire burned with outrage around her. Father, the Emperor, had raged for hours, demanding that the match be declared void and the human executed for his presumption. But the ancient laws were clear, and even the ruler of 1,000 worlds could not break the sacred traditions that held Volanti society together. A wager made before witnesses was binding unto death, and Virolith had spoken her terms in front of the entire Galactic Concord. To break her word would destroy 10,000 years of Volanti honor and make every treaty and agreement her people had ever signed worthless in the eyes of the galaxy. Brothers and sisters came to visit her one by one, each offering their own reaction to her shame. Prince Calith, the eldest and heir to the throne, looked at her with cold disgust and declared that she had contaminated the royal bloodline with her foolishness. Princess Valith, the second-born, wept silver tears and begged Virolith to find some way out of the arrangement before it was too late. But there was no way out, and Virolith found herself strangely calm as she prepared for a future she had never imagined. On the morning of the binding ceremony, a servant came to tell her that the human wished to speak with her privately. She agreed to the meeting out of curiosity, more than courtesy. Wondering what Marcus Cole could possibly have to say to her now that he had won, he came to her chambers alone, without guards or witnesses, which surprised her given how many Volanti would gladly have killed him to prevent the marriage. "Princess," he said, with a slight bow that showed respect without submission, "I wanted to speak with you before the ceremony takes place." Violet studied him with all four of her eyes, searching for any sign of the gloating she expected to find. "Have you come to savor your victory, human?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral, and cold Marcus shook his head slowly, and something in his expression looked almost sad. "I came to offer you a way out," he said, "because I never intended for things to go this far." Violet felt her spine stiffen with surprise and suspicion. "Explain yourself," she demanded. The human moved to stand by her window, looking out at the crystal spires of the imperial city that stretched toward the artificial sky. "When you challenged me to that game, I knew I had to win," he began, "because my people were going to lose everything if I failed. And 100 years of slavery was not a price I was willing to let them pay." He turned back to face her, and his eyes held that strange light she still could not identify. "But I also knew that asking for your hand in marriage was the only stake high enough to make you take the wager seriously," he continued. "And I never actually expected you to honor it once you lost." Violet felt confusion ripple through her carefully ordered mind. "You thought I would break my word?" she asked. "I thought you would find a way around it," Marcus admitted, "because that is what the leaders of my world would have done. And I assumed the galaxy worked the same way everywhere." He took a step toward her, and his voice became softer. "I do not want an unwilling bride, princess. And I certainly do not want to trap you in a life you did not choose. So I have spoken with your father and proposed an alternative arrangement." Violet listened as he explained his offer. The marriage would take place as required by law, but they would live separately and make no demands upon each other. After a suitable period of time, they could seek an annulment through the Galactic Council and both walk away with their honor intact. It was a reasonable solution, a logical escape from an impossible situation, and yet Violet found herself hesitating. "Why would you give up what you won fairly?" she asked, genuinely confused by his behavior. Marcus smiled, and it was a strange expression that seemed to hold both sadness and warmth. "Because winning a game is not the same as winning a person," he answered. "And I have learned that some victories are not worth the cost." Violet spent a long moment in silence, turning his words over in her mind and examining them from every angle. She had expected cruelty, arrogance, and the primitive desire to dominate that she had been taught all humans possessed. Instead, she found something that looked almost like kindness, and she did not know what to do with it. "I will not accept your offer," she finally said, and she saw surprise flash across his face. "May I ask why?" he asked. Violet rose from her seat and approached him until they stood face to face. "Because I have spent my entire life believing that my people were superior to all others in the galaxy," she said. "And you have proven that belief to be false. So now I find myself curious to learn what else I might have been wrong about." She saw understanding dawn in his eyes, followed by something that might have been respect. "The ceremony will proceed as planned," Violet continued, "and I will accompany you to whatever human territory you call home, not as a prisoner or a trophy, but as a student who wishes to understand how a primitive species managed to defeat 10,000 years of Volanti logic." Marcus studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "That is not the answer I expected," he admitted. "Good," Violet replied with the ghost of a smile, "because I am learning that unexpected answers might be more valuable than I ever realized." The binding ceremony took place that evening in a small chamber far from the public. Ivarellis' family did not attend, and the only witnesses were a handful of human diplomats and a single Volanti priest who performed the ritual with barely concealed disdain when it was done. Violeth Kaysan was no longer simply a princess of the Empire. She was also the wife of a human, bound by laws older than most civilizations in the galaxy. As she boarded the human vessel that would take her to the neutral station of Meridian Point, she looked back at the world she had known her entire life. Her father stood on the observation deck of the palace, watching her leave without raising a hand in farewell. Her brother Keleth stood beside him, and even from this distance she could see the hatred burning in his eyes. Violeth turned away and faced the stars that awaited her. She did not know what the future would hold, but for the first time in centuries, she felt something other than boredom and certainty. She felt curious, and perhaps, she admitted only to herself, she felt just a little bit hopeful. Meridian Point was unlike any place Violeth had ever lived. A massive space station that served as neutral ground for dozens of species who wanted to trade and negotiate without the complications of territory and politics. The human embassy occupied one entire section of the station, and it was here that Violeth began her new life. As the wife of Commander Marcus Cole, she had expected primitive conditions, perhaps bare metal walls and the smell of recycled air that never quite felt clean. Instead, she found warmth and color everywhere she looked, with paintings on the walls and plants growing in every corner and music playing softly from hidden speakers. Humans who lived and worked in the embassy greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and cautious friendliness that she did not know how to handle back home in the Volanthi Empire. Servants kept their distance and spoke only when spoken to, treating royalty with the cold respect that protocol demanded. But these humans smiled at her and asked questions about her day and offered to share their food with her as if she were one of them. It was deeply unsettling. Marcus gave her space to adjust, providing her with private quarters and making no demands on her time or attention. He checked on her each morning and evening, asking if she needed anything and accepting her cold responses with patience. She found frustrating. She wanted him to be cruel so she could hate him properly, but he refused to cooperate. Weeks passed, and Violeth began to observe the humans more closely, treating them like subjects in a scientific study. What she discovered challenged everything she thought she knew. She watched a young human woman weep over a fictional story displayed on a screen, tears streaming down her face for characters who did not exist. When Violeth asked why she would waste emotional energy on something imaginary, the woman laughed and wiped her eyes. "Because feeling things deeply is what makes life worth living," the woman answered. "Even when it hurts, even when the feelings are for people who are not real." Violeth did not understand, but she filed the observation away for later analysis. She watched human children play games that had no purpose beyond joy, running and laughing and tumbling over each other like small, chaotic animals. Volanthi children spent their early years in education pods, their minds filled with knowledge, while their bodies grew in carefully controlled environments. The idea of wasting childhood on play seemed inefficient beyond measure, but there was something in the sound of that laughter that stirred a strange feeling in her chest, a feeling she did not have a name for. She watched humans form bonds with small animals they called pets, creatures that served no practical purpose and required constant care. One embassy worker had a small furry creature called a cat that slept on his desk and demanded attention at random intervals. "Why do you keep it?" Violeth asked him one day. The man smiled and scratched behind the animal's ears, producing a strange rumbling sound from its throat. "Because she loves me," he said simply, "and because I love her. And sometimes that is reason enough." Love, the word, appeared again and again in human behavior, and Violeth began to realize that it was the foundation upon which their entire society was built. They did not form alliances based on logic or advantage alone, but on this mysterious emotion that bound them to each other in ways that defied rational analysis. She found herself spending more time with Marcus asking questions about his world and his people, and trying to understand the mind that had defeated her. He was patient with her curiosity, answering every question honestly, even when the answers made his species look foolish. Why do humans go to war over things that do not matter? She asked him one evening as they shared a meal in the embassy dining hall. Because sometimes the things that matter most cannot be measured. He replied, like freedom or dignity or the right to choose your own path in life. Those are abstract concepts, Violet argued. Not resources that can be quantified or territories that can be defended. Marcus set down his eating utensils and looked at her with those strange eyes that she was beginning to find less alien with each passing day. Let me ask you something. Princess, he said, if someone told you that you could never play Nexera again, that you must give up the thing you love most for the rest of your very long life, how would you feel? Violet opened her mouth to answer, but found herself unable to speak. The thought of never playing again, of losing the one thing that brought her joy, created a sensation in her chest that was almost painful. That feeling, Marcus said softly, is what we fight for, because a life without the things we love is not worth living, no matter how safe or logical it might be. The conversation stayed with her for days afterward. Then came the night that changed everything. Violet was walking alone through the embassy corridors when she heard a sound that did not belong. A soft footstep where there should have been silence. Her Volanti senses detected 3 heartbeats hiding in the shadows ahead, and she recognized the rhythm of her own species' assassins before she could call for help. They emerged from the darkness with weapons raised, their faces hidden behind masks that bore the symbol of House Calither. Brother had sent them to end the contamination of the royal bloodline. Evereth prepared to fight, knowing that 3 trained killers against 1 unarmed princess were poor odds even for someone of her abilities. But then Marcus appeared. He came out of nowhere, throwing himself between her and the first assassin's plasma bolt. Taking the shot meant for her heart directly in his chest. He fell, and the smell of burned flesh filled the corridor. But he had bought her the second she needed. Violet fought with a fury she had never known she possessed, using skills she had learned in childhood and never thought she would need. When the last assassin fell, she dropped to her knees beside the man who had saved her. His eyes were open but unfocused, and his breathing was shallow and weak. Why? She demanded as she pressed her hands against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding that seemed far too fast for such a small body to survive. Because, he whispered, and a small smile crossed his pale lips. Sometimes that is reason enough. The medical team arrived moments later and rushed into the healing chamber, leaving Violet alone in the corridor with blood on her hands and something breaking inside her chest. She had dismissed humans as primitive and weak, as creatures driven by emotions they could not control. But Marcus Cole had chosen to die for someone who had shown him nothing but coldness, because love did not require logic, and sacrifice did not require reward. Sitting outside the medical bay while the doctors fought to save his life, Violet finally understood what that strange feeling in her chest had been all along. She was falling in love with her husband, and she was terrified that she might lose him before she ever had the chance to tell him. Marcus Cole survived. The human doctors worked through the night and into the next day, using every technique their advanced medicine could offer. And somehow they pulled him back from the edge of death. Violet did not leave the medical bay for 3 days, sleeping in a chair beside his bed and refusing food until the nurses threatened to sedate her and feed her through a tube. When Marcus finally opened his eyes and saw her there, his first words were not about the pain or the attack. "You look terrible, Princess," he said with a weak smile. Violet laughed, and the sound surprised her because she could not remember the last time she had laughed at anything. "You nearly died saving my life," she told him. "And you waste your first words on insults?" "Not an insult," he replied, his voice still rough from the breathing tube they had removed. Just an observation that you should take better care of yourself." She took his hand in hers. And for the first time since her childhood, she allowed herself to feel without analyzing or controlling the emotion. "I'm sorry," she said. "For everything, for how I treated you, for the coldness I showed when you offered me nothing but kindness." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "You were not cold," he said. "You were scared, and scared people build walls to protect themselves. And I have been waiting patiently for you to feel safe enough to lower yours." The assassination attempt had consequences that reached far beyond one man's. Injury Violeth sent evidence of her brother's involvement to the Galactic Council, and the resulting scandal rocked the Volanti Empire to its foundations. Prince Caliph denied everything. But the assassins had been sloppy, and too many trails led back to his household. He needed a distraction, and he found one by declaring war on humanity. The official reason was the threat that human emotional influence posed to Volanti purity. But everyone knew the truth. Caliph wanted to destroy the species that had humiliated his sister, and by extension his entire family. And he would burn worlds to ashes to restore his wounded pride. The Volanti Armada was the most powerful military force in the galaxy, with ships that could calculate perfect attack vectors and weapons that operated with mathematical precision. Earth's fleet was tiny by comparison, a collection of vessels that had been exploring the stars for less than 200 years. Everyone expected the war to last a few weeks at most. 3 years later, the fighting showed no signs of ending. Violeth watched the war unfold from Meridian Point, which had declared neutrality and become a refuge for those caught between the two powers. She and Marcus worked together to help human civilians escape the conflict zones, using her knowledge of Volanti tactics to predict where strikes would occur. It was not enough, and every day brought news of more deaths and more destruction. "We are losing," Marcus admitted one night as they reviewed the latest reports together. "Slowly but surely, my people are being pushed back toward Earth, and eventually there will be nowhere left to run." Violet studied the tactical displays, her 4 eyes tracking patterns that she knew all too well. "Your ships are faster than ours," she said, "and your crews are more adaptable, but you keep fighting the way we expect you to fight, and that is why you are losing." Marcus looked at her with curiosity. "What do you suggest?" "Stop being predictable," she answered. "Stop trying to win the war with logic, because you will never outcalculate a Volanti commander, and start fighting in ways that make no sense." She showed him what she meant, pointing to positions on the map where human forces could strike without any apparent strategic value. "My people expect you to protect your important targets and attack ours," she explained. "So do neither. Attack places that do not matter, defend positions that should be abandoned, and make every engagement a puzzle that our commanders cannot solve." The humans listened, and then they did something that surprised even Viralithi. Took her advice and made it even more chaotic than she had imagined. Human ships began broadcasting music into Volanti communication frequencies, disrupting the cold efficiency of their tactical networks with sounds that no logical mind could process. They turned asteroid fields into hidden fortresses that appeared on no maps and struck from positions that should have been impossible. They used psychological warfare, sending messages of surrender that turned into jokes, and jokes that turned into genuine offers of peace. The Volanti commanders did not know how to respond to an enemy that refused to behave like an enemy. Human prisoners laughed in the face of interrogation, told stories about their families and their dreams, and asked their captors questions about their own lives that no one had ever thought to ask. Before Volanti soldiers began to hesitate, to wonder, to question the war. They were fighting against beings who seemed so strange, and yet so familiar. Virith saw the reports and recognized what was happening. The humans were not just fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for the right to exist as they were. Emotional and chaotic, and beautifully illogical. And that conviction gave them a strength that pure reason could never match when the opportunity came to strike at the heart of the Volanthe fleet. Marcus asked Violeth to join him. "I need you," he said. "Not just for your knowledge of their ships, but because you are the bridge between our peoples. And this war will not end until someone shows both sides that we can work together." Violeth did not hesitate. She had chosen her side long ago. In a medical bay, while waiting to see if the man she loved would live or died, the strike team was small. Just 12 humans and one Volanthe princess, flying a captured vessel. Into the heart of enemy territory, they made it. Past the outer defenses, by using codes that Violeth remembered from her years in the Imperial Court, they avoided patrols by predicting where Volanthe logic would expect them to be and going somewhere else. Entirely when they finally reached the flagship, where Prince Calith commanded his forces, Violeth felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt sad. This was her brother, the boy she had played with as a child. The prince who had once told her stories about the great Volanthe heroes of old war had turned him into a monster. But she remembered the person he had been before pride and hatred consumed him. Final confrontation happened on the bridge of the flagship, with Calith surrounded by his guards and Marcus's team holding positions at every entrance. "Sister," Calith spat, "you dare to show your face here after betraying your own blood for these animals?" Violeth stepped forward, unarmed and unafraid. "I did not betray our people, brother," she said. "I tried to save them from a war we cannot win, because the humans have something we lost long ago, and no amount of firepower will ever be able to defeat it." Calith laughed, but there was fear beneath the sound. What could these primitives possibly have that we lack? Violeth looked at Marcus, at the humans who had become her friends and family, and she smiled. "Hope," she answered. "They have hope, and hope is stronger than logic, stronger than fear, and strong enough to change the galaxy." She challenged her brother to one final game of Nexra, broadcast across every frequency in the fleet. The winner would decide the fate of the war, and this time, Violeth would play like a human. The Nexra board was set up in the center of the flagship's bridge, and every screen in the Volanthe Armada displayed the game that would decide the future of two civilizations. Prince Calith sat across from his sister with confidence burning in his 4 eyes, certain that he could defeat her just as he had defeated so many others in his rise to military command. "You were always the better player," he admitted as the game began. "But that was before you contaminated your mind with human weakness. And now you will see how far you have fallen." Violeth made her opening move and said nothing. The first hour of the game proceeded exactly as Calith expected, with both players trading pieces in careful exchanges that revealed nothing of their true strategies. Volanthe officers watched with professional interest, analyzing each move and calculating probable outcomes as their training demanded. Human observers watched with something else entirely, something that looked like faith. When the second hour began, Violeth changed her approach. She started making moves that seemed to have no logical purpose, sacrificing valuable pieces without gaining any apparent advantage, and opening weaknesses in her defenses that invited Attic. Laughed and pressed forward, certain that his sister had finally cracked under the pressure. "Your human friends have ruined you," he said as he captured another of her pieces. "You play like a child who has forgotten everything she learned." But Marcus watched from the edge of the room with a small smile on his face, because he recognized what Violeth was doing. She was playing the way he had played on that first night, creating chaos that logic could not navigate, building traps that only appeared after the moment to avoid them had passed by. The third hour, Calith's confidence had begun to fade. He stared at the board with growing confusion. unable to understand how his overwhelming advantage had somehow transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. Every move he made seemed to trigger consequences he had not anticipated, and every weakness he exploited turned out to be a strength in disguise. "How are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "This is not Nexra. This is madness." Violet looked up from the board and met her brother's eyes. "You are right," she said calmly. "It is madness, and that is exactly why you cannot defeat it. Because you spent your entire life learning to predict rational behavior, and you have no defense against an opponent who refuses to be rational." She made her next move, and Keleth saw the trap close around him. His king piece was not yet captured, but every possible escape route led to greater disaster. And no matter how many possibilities he calculated, he could not find a path to victory. "Surrender," Violet said. "End this war before more of our people die for your pride. And perhaps some good can still come from all this destruction." Keleth's hand trembled above the board as he searched for an option that did not exist. "I cannot," he whispered. "If I surrender now, I will lose everything. My command, my position, my future as emperor. You already lost those things when you started a war you could not win," Violet replied. "The only question now is whether you will lose your honor as well." The silence stretched across the bridge and throughout the fleet, with thousands of Volanti soldiers waiting to see what their prince would choose. Finally, slowly, Keleth reached out and tipped over his king piece, the symbol of surrender. "The war is over," Violet declared, her voice carrying across every frequency. "By the ancient laws of our people, the terms of this contest are binding, and all Volanti forces will stand down immediately." The response was not immediate. Acceptance. Some commanders refused to acknowledge the surrender, insisting that the contest had been rigged or that human tricks had somehow corrupted the outcome. But the majority of the fleet had watched the game unfold, had seen their prince outmaneuvered by tactics they could not understand, and they recognized the truth, even if it wounded their pride. The humans had won, not through superior firepower or greater numbers, but through the same unpredictable thinking that had started this entire conflict years ago. In a crystal hall far away, Emperor Kassan the Eternal received the news on his throne, surrounded by advisors who urged him to continue the war despite his son's surrender. But the old emperor was tired, and he had lived long enough to recognize when the galaxy was changing around him. "My daughter has proven something I did not wish to see," he said in an address to his people. "She has shown that logic alone is not enough to thrive in this universe, and that perhaps we have something to learn from these beings we dismissed as primitive." The peace negotiations took months to complete, with representatives from both species meeting on Meridian Point to hammer out the terms of a new relationship. Humanity did not demand tribute or territory or any of the things the Volanti had expected. They asked only for partnership, for the chance to work together as equals and share the knowledge that each species had accumulated. It was such a reasonable request that many Volanti did not know how to respond. Virith served as the primary negotiator, bridging the gap between two cultures that thought they had nothing in common. She taught her people that emotion was not weakness but strength, that hope could fuel accomplishments that logic alone could never achieve. She taught the humans that Volanti were not cold machines, but beings who had simply forgotten how to feel, and that patience and understanding could reach hearts that seemed forever closed. 5 years after the war ended, Violet stood on the balcony of Earth's first interstellar embassy, watching the sun set over a world she had come to love. Marcus stood beside her, older now, but still carrying that strange light in his eyes that she had finally learned to recognize. It was hope. She knew now. It was the stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better than today. No matter how dark the present moment seemed. In her arms, she held their daughter, a child who had her mother's silver skin and her father's warm smile. who would grow up in a galaxy where Volanthi and humans worked together as friends and allies. Do you ever regret it? Marcus asked, his voice soft in the evening air. The game you lost, the life you left behind? Violet watched the colors paint the sky in shades no Volanthi crystal had ever captured. And she thought about all the things she had gained since that night when her certainty had shattered. She had gained a day. Husband who loved her not for her title or her power, but for who she truly was. She had gained a daughter who represented the future of both their species. She had gained a purpose greater than games and politics. A mission to help two civilizations grow together instead of destroying each other. And most importantly, she had gained something she never knew she was missing. She had gained hope. I did not lose that game, she said finally, pulling her daughter closer and leaning into her husband's embrace. I simply did not understand yet what winning looked like. Marcus laughed and kissed her forehead. And their daughter made a happy sound that might have been agreement below them. The streets of the human city came alive with lights as night fell. And somewhere in the distance, music began to play. It was a human song. One of thousands that Violet had learned to love over the years. Full of emotion and meaning that defied logical analysis. She did not try to analyze it anymore. She simply listened. And felt and loved, because sometimes that was reason enough, far across the galaxy. The Volanthi Empire was changing. Young Volanthi sought out human art and music. Fascinated by the feelings these strange creations stirred in their hearts, old traditions were questioned and debated. And new ideas took root in minds that had been closed for 10,000 years. Not everyone welcomed the change. And there would be struggles and setbacks in the years to come, but the seeds had been planted. And nothing in the galaxy could stop them from growing. Violet had gambled and lost, and in losing, she had won everything that mattered, because the humans had taught her the most important lesson of all life. Was not a game to be won or lost, it was a gift to be experienced, shared and loved, and she intended to love every moment of the long and wonderful life that stretched before her. Surrounded by the family she had never expected to find, and the hope she had never known she needed. Stars burned bright above her new home. And Violet Kaysan smiled. Her story was just beginning.